Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Herbst, and I am president of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. I'd like to welcome you to a very special conversation with Ken Marcus about fighting anti-Semitism on campus through law. But first, I'd like to welcome you to another program in AJU's Open Learning program. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've sponsored well over 200 programs to educate, inform, and entertain you, and we've been gratified by the more than 150,000 people who have registered for our programs. We hope that you'll go to our website, www.aju.edu, often to see the exciting programs coming up. Of course, this program and many of our other programs are free, but they're not costless to produce. We also hope that you'll continue to support AJU and its open learning programs. You'll see in the chat function, we've put a link, and we'd be very gratified for any donation that you can provide. This will help ensure that we'll continue to have dynamic and robust programming in the years to come. It's a pleasure today to welcome Ken Marcus, founder and chairman of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, one of the primary organizations fighting anti-Semitism on college campuses across the United States. Ken has a distinguished history as a scholar, and he was also Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. The Brandeis Center has been at the fore of fighting anti-Semitism on campuses for many years, and notably since October 7th, and has in recent months taken legal action against many colleges and universities, including the University of Vermont, Berkeley Law, and American University, among many others, for severe and persistent anti-Semitism on those campuses. Ken, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Very good to be here. Thank you.
Ken, maybe you could explain briefly what the Brandeis Center is and what it does.
Sure, Jeff. Thank you for asking. I founded the Louis D. Brandeis Center over a dozen years ago to fight anti-Semitism on and off college campuses based on my fear that what we were already seeing back then, in which I had been monitoring and fighting even for a decade before that, was something likely to grow in ways that we were not, as a community, prepared to address. Further, that we needed to address it not just with education, which is always important, but also with law. That law is an indispensable tool for addressing any number of different social problems, and that in some cases, it is necessary to hold wrongdoers accountable when they're responsible for the anti-Semitic incidents that we were already seeing on college campuses and that we were concerned were going to get only worse.
And in our conversation before the program began, you noted that in the years before October 7th, you met with a mixed reception from Jewish audiences who didn't always take your message fully about anti-Semitism on campus. Can you recount that history?
Sure, I always found the audiences to be polite, but often there was a question. Why are we talking about anti-Semitism? Why just about the Jewish community? Why not talk about hate or bias affecting African Americans or Hispanic or women or other groups? Why focus on the Jewish community? Now, I'll tell you that I had also spoken about other forms of discrimination over time with other groups who didn't respond in that way. So, for example, speaking to African American audiences about anti-Black racism, they wouldn't say, why just talk about racism? Or going to Indian country and talking about bias against Native Americans, they wouldn't say, why just talk about this issue? The Jewish community, uniquely in my experience, would often respond by asking, why just talk about us? Why not talk more broadly about the problem?
I'll be talking with Ken for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we welcome questions from you, the audience. You can begin to submit your questions now through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Ken, the United States has thousands of colleges and universities, but from the 30,000-foot perspective, can you say how you understand anti-Semitism on college campuses since October 7th?
Sure. So there was a time a number of years ago when we looked at what we called hotspot campuses. There were a few campuses in California and up the West Coast and in New England down to New York, perhaps New Jersey, where we saw problems at a relatively low level, but still concerning to us, that would recur year after year. In recent years, we no longer talk about hotspot campuses because we realize that it's no longer just a regional problem. It is still true that we get a disproportionate number of calls from people on the two coasts. It is also disproportionately true that the same campuses that we were talking about 20 years ago, we're talking about today. Nevertheless, today, 2024, we're seeing problems on more campuses than ever before. And while there are some campuses that are worse than others, there really is no college campus where one can say definitively that kids are going to be safe next year. This is now truly a problem of a global nature and certainly throughout the United States. It's gotten worse. It's gotten more frequent. It's more in your face, and a greater number of Jewish students are being victimized by it.
And you noted greater preponderance on the coast. There have also been other attempts to try to ascertain why some campuses might be more susceptible to anti-Semitism. There was a Washington Monthly study on that elite campuses, find that as you want, were more likely. What are your views as kind of the structural determinants of why some campuses might be more susceptible than others?
Some university administrators respond more forcefully than others. Some faculty are more complicit in the problem than others. Some institutions simply have a culture that has been permitted to worsen over time, not just with the students and the student organizations, but also with the curriculum and with the faculty. Oftentimes, there's a failure of leadership at some institutions, which means that the problem is only going to get worse.
And there's a debate about the nature of, especially the encampments that we saw in the spring of 2024. Debate, simply put, as whether these are organic protests or whether they've been orchestrated or supported by national organizations, or as the Director of National Intelligence indicated, was partially correct, foreign actors, including Iran. What's your view as kind of the impetuses for especially the protests that we saw in spring 2024?
There's definitely all of that. There certainly has been evidence of coordinated, well-funded efforts, some perhaps state-sponsored by Iran or other bad actors. And then there are copycats around the country as well. So it is a mix of funded professional anti-Zionist agitators, and then students who are spontaneously trying to mimic what's happening at other institutions, including some very bad actions that they're replicating.
Why don't we get to the law and regulations? What does the law demand of colleges and universities in terms of protecting students from anti-Semitism, other forms of hate and bigotry? Maybe you could give the audience a little primer.
Sure, Jeff. There are so many laws that we deal with because there are so many laws that the anti-Semitic students are breaking. Range from criminal codes of the various states to constitutional protections of Jewish students, like the free speech protection that is so often being violated when Jewish students are silenced. The most important single statute that we deal with is probably Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which protects students at both public and private colleges from discrimination at federally funded institutions based on race, color, national origin, and under a policy that I developed about 20 years ago that includes Jewish students as well as students from other ethno-religious groups. When there is an indication of anti-Semitic discrimination or harassment, the institution needs to investigate and must provide a prompt and effective response. That prompt and effective response that's required by the law is that we are too seldom seeing in practice. And when institutions fail to provide it, they can be held accountable.
Maybe you could give us a good example first. You don't have to name the institution, but describe a process that works when a problem has emerged.
So what we ask for, and we have best practices on our website for combating anti-Semitism. Perhaps we can share a link. We have seen that when institutions are prompt, direct, forceful, when senior officials like the presidents are engaged, when they're specifically naming anti-Semitism without being vague or general, when they're punishing those students who need to be punished, when they're respecting the freedom of speech but not hiding behind it, when they're using these sorts of best practices, there are going to be good results. Generally speaking, virtually any best practice that we can think of, we've seen somewhere or other. The problem is that few institutions are consistently doing all of the right things and doing them when they need to be done.
I noted at the beginning that you've brought legal actions against a number of schools. Can you describe the process by which you decide to bring legal action and what the results are that you hope? And here, since these are public actions, feel free to indicate institutions.
Sure. Well, we are constantly being approached by students and families, and we have a help button on our website for people to reach out to us. We also have a partnership with the Anti-Defamation League in Hillel through a so-called call center. People reach out to us and they talk about what's happened to them, and we want to know, is what happened severe, pervasive at an institution? What is the nature of the problem? Is it timely or barred by a statute of limitations? Is it the sort of thing that potentially could be a hostile environment? We seldom simply say, we're sorry, this isn't a lawsuit. We usually can find some way to help the student. If there isn't a strong legal claim, we can, at a minimum, help the student to find their own voice and to speak out in ways that will resonate with university administrators because they speak the administrator's language in terms of potential liability under federal civil rights laws. So we find lots of different ways of helping, but when there is a significant violation of law, we will sometimes file a lawsuit. And we have lawsuits pending against the University of California at Berkeley, against Harvard University, against the New York City public school system, and in Southern California against the Santa Ana public school system, as well as against an association of public interest legal advisors, a labor union that's discriminating against its members. Those are the lawsuits. In other circumstances, we might file an administrative complaint with the agency that I formerly ran, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Those are cases in which the Education Department could potentially turn off the funding to an institution that has violated federal law. Depending on the facts and circumstances, some of cases might be better for a lawsuit and others for an OCR action. We will do whichever is most appropriate under the circumstances.
Let's describe some examples and what you think the appropriate response is and when your center might get involved. Let's say there are persistent demonstrations where people are chanting from the river to the sea, globalize Antifada, and some other things that we've seen. How do you understand that in the range of anti-Semitism, and what's the expected response that you would like to see from administrators?
From the river to the sea, we see as a genocidal threat. It may not be an immediate or direct threat, but it's certainly a threat. We see it as an implied call for a physical attack on the state of Israel with a potential annihilation of the Jewish people of Israel. Generally speaking, what we find is that where there is hate speech, there's also going to be hate conduct. And we typically focus our cases where there is conduct as well as the speech. Having said that, there have been a couple of recent important statements from my successor at the OCR agency, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR. And what they have made clear recently is that there are times when even protected speech under the Constitution could create a hostile environment for Jewish students. And when that happens, the obligation of the university is to respond to the hostile environment but to do so without either restricting the speech or punishing the speaker. It's a very delicate situation because, as an organization named for the late Justice Brandeis, we are concerned about the freedom of speech, but we're also concerned about environments in which genocidal threats can be permitted against the Jewish people, even when microaggressions are not tolerated against other groups.
Right, there's a lot there to unpack. Let me get the last part of what you said, which is, do you think that college campuses have handled or handling anti-Semitism differently from other forms of hatred and bigotry?
No question about it. And I realize that many groups think that they're treated worse than others, but it seems to me that anti-Semitism on college campuses really is different from the others for a couple of reasons. One is that other forms of hate or bias tend to get a unified response from a wide variety of groups, especially progressive and minority groups. Whereas anti-Semitism, especially when it takes the form of anti-Zionism, will not receive that sort of support from across the board. In fact, if there are progressives who are involved in the problem, the universities will tend to be divided. Often the faculty will be divided, and you won't get the same sort of strong response that you would otherwise receive.
And what would you have expected the response to be to the encampment movement in the spring of 2024, and what did you see in practice?
What we saw during the encampment movement had two sides to it. On the one hand, there were, on many institutions, clear and significant violations of content-neutral rules based on time, place, or manner. That is to say, there were institutions that had rules based on safety or hygiene against camping, against on quads, against obstructing pedestrian access, against using sound amplification in ways that could be harmful to students. All of those rules were being violated, and they were not being even-handedly or forcefully enforced. In addition to that, of course, these encampments involved often harassment of Jewish students, and in particular, Jewish students who happened to be Israeli or supportive of Israel. And so that added an extra level of harassment. We would have liked to see a response that was appropriate to the extent of the problem and to the fact that there was a violation not only of the federally protected civil rights of Jewish students, but of, in many cases, the college's own rules. And yet universities too often fail to address them. And in some cases, police forces were required to stand down, including at the direction of some mayors. So we saw in many places very disappointing responses. Having said that, there were some strong and even very strong responses from other universities. So we saw a real mix across the board from campus to campus and state to state.
And you mentioned before, and I want to go back to it, but first note to the audience that I'll be speaking with Ken for a few more minutes, and then we'll get to your questions. Please start submitting them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Ken, you noted before that you're also suing some school districts. We've talked mainly about colleges and universities, but maybe you could explicate the issues in that litigation.
For a number of years, we have realized that there were issues not only on the colleges and universities, but also in the elementary and high schools. The issues are sometimes the same and sometimes different. This last year, we have seen an absolute explosion of problems in the high schools. Now, the problems that we're seeing in the high schools, we should think of in a couple of respects. First, the Jewish high school students who are being harmed are at a particularly vulnerable age, even more so than college students. Second, when you look at the extent of what's happening in high schools and think about next year and the year after in colleges, you have to realize that aside from the foreign students bringing anti-Semitic views into the college campus, we're now going to have high school students who have been facing anti-Zionist indoctrination and who have been developing anti-Semitic attitudes going into the college campuses as well. So what are we seeing? So there are a few different things. One, we're sometimes seeing colleges that have radical anti-Zionist faculty who are training high school teachers and developing curricula that are anti-Israel to be used on high school faculties. We are seeing involvement from teachers' unions that are sometimes radical and anti-Zionist. We are seeing in some places critical or liberated ethnic studies, especially in parts of California, that cross a line into anti-Semitism, and the prospect that this is going to go elsewhere around the country. But then we're also seeing everything from old school traditional anti-Semitism, throw pennies at the feet of the Jewish students, to a replication of collegiate misbehavior by the younger siblings of the college students who are chanting from the river to the sea at the high schools where they're conducting walkouts, similar to what you might see at a college campus. So we're seeing lots of different problems, some copycats, some generated by students, some by teachers, some by the school district, and some by the teachers' unions. So multiple different forces that are creating problems in the high schools that are much worse than what we'd seen before. And I would say that the dramatic increase in problems that we've seen in the high schools this past year has been even greater than on the college campuses, even though there's been less attention to it. That's why we filed lawsuits in both California and New York. And we're talking to families every day about problems in their areas that we might need to address next.
And you noted some tensions with free speech issues, including the recent OCR pronouncements. Some say that there's a so-called Palestinian exception when it comes to issues about the Middle East on college campuses. How have you understood the tension or lack of tension between the work you do and the free speech protections that college students enjoy?
Much more often, it's the other way around. What we're seeing is Jewish students who want to have pro-Israel speakers are being shut down. The speakers are being heckled into silence or being forced off campus, or the students being discouraged from speaking. We're finding Jewish students who are afraid to wear clothing that signifies support for Israel or the IDF. We're finding Jewish students who are basically being told that if Zionism is a part of their Jewish identity, they are not wanted, that they can't be a part of book clubs or other student groups, even being thrown out of sexual assault survivors groups based on their expression of their Jewish identity as Zionists. So we are seeing in many different forms successful efforts to shut down Jewish speech. I'm not going to say that there isn't anything on the other side where there aren't anti-Israel students who are being discouraged from expressing their views. But the primary speech issues that we see is that the primary elite college campuses simply are not places in which there is free speech for a Jewish perspective, especially if that Jewish perspective is pro-Israel in any respect.
My last question before we get to the audience, and there's a lot of audience questions, please keep submitting them. Colleges and universities made a huge investment in the last few years in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and personnel, bureaucracies. Some people argue that they were ineffective. Some people argue that they're part of the problem because they have a worldview where Jewish students are perceived as white, privileged, and therefore either immune or not relevant to charges of bigotry. What's your evaluation of the DEI enterprise, especially given what you've seen since October 7th?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Major universities have, as a whole, substantially increased their investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion over the last few years, creating large bureaucracies that often drive up tuition very significantly based on the notion that minority students need support. So you would expect these institutions today, of all times, to be ready for a problem like this because they have been growing, especially since the George Floyd murder. They have been growing to meet a perceived need to protect minority students. And I will say that there are some students who have told us that their DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, have been helpful to them. They've been a sympathetic listener. Maybe they put on some programming that has been useful to them. But this has been the exception rather than the rule. Far more students have said they're no help whatsoever. In some cases, they've said the DEI folks really view their mission as being to deal with marginalized groups, and they view Jews not as being marginalized. We've seen research suggesting that DEI officials at colleges and universities tend to have very heavily anti-Zionist perspectives, which sometimes crosses the line into anti-Semitism, which means that the personnel themselves may be the problem. Oftentimes, they will refuse to address anti-Semitism or Jewish identity, even when dealing with other groups. And worse than that, there is often a mindset within the DEI community that divides people into two groups. You're either an oppressor or you're the oppressed. And when everyone is divided into that, we know where the Jewish community is usually placed. They don't say Jews have faced a history of persecution. They say Jews are white. And they will say that even when they're confronted with Jewish Americans who may be of different racial or ethnic backgrounds. But they certainly view Jews as being a kind of a white group that is privileged and powerful and should own their privilege and consider their own power, even if the student body of a particular college might be primarily not rich or wealthy. And that way of thinking can feed into traditional anti-Jewish stereotypes about power, control, conspiracy, so on and so forth. So DEI, while it's supposed to be a solution, is too often a part of the problem.
And why don't we go now to the questions? And right off the bat, two questions, similar topic. One of a member of our audience writes, I'm a law professor at Baruch College, where I used to be a professor. CUNY recently reached a settlement with the Department of Education to ostensibly resolve anti-Semitism, but it seems to be little more than a fig leaf. And another member of the audience writes, have you seen any penalties or significant consequences for violations of Title VI by colleges or universities, or is a threat of enforcement not yet accompanied by clear outcomes?
Sure. Well, definitely great to hear someone from CUNY, from Baruch College, where I was very proud to be a teacher for a few years. So a few things. First, I would say the University of Vermont, one of our cases, is an excellent example of a resolution through OCR, which, by the accounts of people in Vermont, has taken that university from worst to first. That was a term used by the Hillel director there, which is to say, before the Brandeis Center, working with Jewish on campus, filed our Title VI case, some viewed the University of Vermont as being the worst campus for responding to anti-Semitism. Nobody says it's perfect now. However, there are many in Vermont who are saying that as a result of the resolution agreement, there has been a very dramatic change for the better in the way the university responds to anti-Semitic incidents when they arise. During my tenure at OCR, we had resolutions at my alma mater, Williams College, also Duke, University of North Carolina, various institutions that I think were helpful. There are questions about whether some of the most recent resolutions from this administration have been equally strong. And I have to say that I definitely would have been stronger in some of these resolutions. Having said that, if you just read the words on a resolution agreement, you might not have a sense of how they have an impact on the administration and on the board. It is my sense that even those resolution agreements, which we may have found to be disappointing, weaker than what we would have liked, nevertheless have a change in behavior from the universities when issues arise. I understand that there are some who look at some of the agreements and say they would like something stronger, and I'm not going to disagree. I also would say that we are not going to put all of our eggs in one basket. This is part of why we are going to federal district court with lawsuits and not just going to OCR. But I do think it's important to have both. I do think that there are some levers that one has through the OCR process for which the courts aren't enough. So I think you really need to be able to do both, to file with OCR when the cases warrant it, and to go to federal district court for the right case as well.
And extending from the audience questions, there's been a lot of notice that a lot of the demonstrators who were arrested, Columbia and elsewhere, had charges dropped. A lot of the students who were under disciplinary procedures at various campuses had those disciplinary procedures dropped and were allowed to graduate. Is that a disappointment to you? Expected? Did you expect more?
It's a massive disappointment, and I think that it's partly a result of some permissive attitudes that some of the new prosecutors have in certain major cities around the country. Some of it is, I think, a fault of the universities for not pressing harder. Some of it is a matter of ignorance on the part of prosecutors. We definitely think that prosecutors need to do better. That's certainly a field that we're looking into, and we would like to see responses from prosecutors to anti-Jewish hate crimes that reflect the severity of the problem. We're not seeing that the way we ought to.
And another member of the audience writes, is using Title VI or hopefully adding anti-Semitism as a separate category in the Clery Act a more effective way to hold institutions of higher education accountable, which is a very erudite and interesting question.
I think that we should use every tool available. We shouldn't say we're only going to use a hammer or a screwdriver. We should have the whole toolkit, and we should use whatever is appropriate. Clery has its role. It is a statute that requires disclosure of certain hate crimes that take place on or near campus and provides monetary penalties for failure. Some of those penalties in some cases can actually be quite large, where one is dealing with a large number of problems. But the Clery Act deals with hate crimes. It doesn't deal with the broad range of harassment that Title VI deals with. It's usually something that you can really only focus on after the fact. And there are lots of limitations in the ability for enforcement. There is pending legislation from Senator Cassidy that would strengthen Clery protection. So it could be that Clery would have more possibility in the future if that legislation is passed and we don't lobby for or against bills. But right now, it seems to me there's no single tool that has magic to it. You need to use all of them.
And another member of the audience writes, on my campus, we had an enactment and the protesters, many of whom are Jewish, have effectively silenced a good portion of the campus that is not anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. How do you deal with the fact that Jewish students were, if not numerically, certainly prominently displayed as part of the campus protests?
It certainly makes it harder for the community when there are Jewish students involved, and the presence of even a small number of Jewish students will always be magnified. It's considered more newsworthy when the Jewish students are anti-Israel. So every Jewish student who says, as a Jew, I'm against Israel, those students will have microphones. There's no Palestinian exception for them. Anyone who is speaking out against Israel, especially if they're Jewish, will get disproportionate recognition. So yes, I think it is unfortunate that there are some within the Jewish community who are perhaps choosing to associate with others that maybe they will come to regret. It does make things harder for all of us. Worse than the Jewish students, though, are the Jewish grown-ups who are often speaking out against the Jewish community in the state of Israel. They are still a minority, though. They're still a relatively small minority of the Jewish community that gets massively disproportionate coverage in the media and attention from administrations.
And how do you respond to it can't be anti-Zionism can't be anti-Semitic if some Jews are on the other side, as it were?
There have always been with any minority some degree of division, and we in the Jewish community have valued dissent perhaps more than others, and that value that we place on dissent has had value in some circumstances in the past, but it also creates problems for us. It is not a new phenomenon for persecuted groups to adopt prejudices that are against them. This is not new to Jewish history. It's not new to the history of other peoples, but it's a challenge that we need to work on when it comes to education and community building.
And a parent writes who has kids in K through 12, how do we best address the anti-Semitism in the teachers' unions and the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel resolutions that we're now seeing some of the teachers' unions consider?
It really is sad what has become of so many teachers' unions and also professors' unions and also other unions. One thing to keep in mind is that unions are subject to the Civil Rights Act, including Title VII, which protects against employment discrimination. So other teachers, sometimes Jewish teachers, will come to us indicating that they have faced harassment in a hostile environment. They may have a claim, and we do have attorneys at the Louis D. Brandeis Center who will represent them in that. That would be a direct way of addressing problems with the union, and we have multiple cases of that sort. In other cases, the union is creating a problem for the students, and then you just have to connect the dots in the right way. Sometimes it's a better case, sometimes a more tenuous case, but we're always open to seeing what's going on in a particular school district.
My practice is not to identify audience members, but this is from my good friend Mark Schwal, who's head of school at D. Toledo High School. And Mark writes, what is your reaction, thoughts on the recent ruling by the federal court instructing UCLA to have a plan to protect Jewish students? What should UCLA and other similar situated universities be doing?
I was glad to see that news this morning. I've seen the news accounts as opposed to the order from the judge. It seems to me that this was a strong case. It wasn't one of our cases. I'll say it was brought by Beckett Fund and former U.S. Solicitor General Paul Clement. But a strong opinion from the judge, and I hope it leads to a good plan. There should be lots of elements to a plan to address anti-Semitism, and they should be shaped to address the specific problems at the specific institution. Whatever else the plan does, it should include a way of ensuring that there is compliance with the executive order on combating anti-Semitism, which is a key federal provision established by former President Donald Trump, which provides that federal officials evaluating anti-Semitism claims in colleges and universities will consider the so-called IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the very best definition that we have available for dealing with the practical problems. So that should be a part of any plan that is adopted by a college or university. There are lots of other components to it. We have best practices for addressing anti-Semitism, some of which are on our website and available for people to see.
And we're getting dozens of questions, not surprising. I want to read one from a college student where he writes that on my campus, the hundreds of students who have been chanting Antifada, the campus has deemed this non-actionable as harassment beyond referring me to counseling. How can I follow up with campus administrators to convince them not to ignore this hate speech?
Well, in terms of convincing them not to ignore it, there is a May 7 letter from OCR that will show that they need to address even hate speech and not just hate actions. There are also recent decisions by OCR that can back that up. Again, we support protection of free speech. We wouldn't want university administrators to think that we are trying to censor free speech. However, the rules need to be applied. And if any student wants support from Brandeis Center lawyers in how they can communicate best to their administration about this, we're available at brandeiscenter.com to talk you through it. Our website also has other information for other ways of reaching us. We're happy to help.
And what's your advice to donors, many of whom are loyal alums to institutions that molded them, that they've supported for many years, but now are very challenged by what they see happening on those campuses? What do you think they should be doing?
Sure. Well, Jeff, in response to that question, I think my board of directors would probably be very upset with me if I didn't observe that we at the Louis D. Brandeis Center are a nonprofit organization that receives tax-exempt contributions under the IRS code, and our website provides various ways of giving. We rely on contributions from people concerned about this issue. But the question is also about how they can have impact with a college or university, and I would have to say that it is very important for people to make their voices heard wherever they are alumni, and especially if they are contributors, and to reach out to the office of the president to let them know that you are a concerned alumnus or a concerned parent of paying tuition, or a supporter of the school, and be very specific in what you would like to see being done that's different. The university, of course, should follow its principles and do the right thing regardless of what funders are saying. Nevertheless, when they are deciding whether to do the right thing or not, it doesn't hurt for their supporters to emphasize that when they do the right thing, it will be viewed favorably by their contributor base.
And another member of the audience writes, are you expecting an update to the 2019 executive order, which you referenced before, at any point in the near future? And do you expect a policy change that could make explicit distinctions between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
So two things about that executive order. It's absolutely critical. It ensures that Jews continue to receive protection against Title VI, which is absolutely fundamental, and that the gold standard IRA working definition is used. So two things about that. First, I recommended a number of years ago that this decision by the president be codified into a formal regulation. During the last administration, that recommendation was accepted, but the work wasn't done as of the time of the inauguration of President Biden. I was delighted to see the Biden team immediately indicate that they would do this work, and they would issue a formal regulation administering the executive order combating anti-Semitism, and they provided a date several months into the future when they would do it. They missed that deadline. They gave themselves another deadline. They missed that one too. They then extended it by another year, with the current deadline being December of this year when they promised to do it. I'm not holding my breath. I don't think it's going to happen anytime real soon. Certainly by this administration, they've had plenty of time to do it. It wouldn't take very long. There's another way of getting. It could be that another administration, either Harris or Trump, would do it. There's another approach also. The same thing can be done by a bill called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would be even stronger. We don't lobby for and against bills, but I will say that this is one of the most forceful approaches to addressing anti-Semitism. It has been passed by the House of Representatives, and the question is whether Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will call a roll call on that bill in the Senate. If he does, I believe it will pass. The question is, will he do it? So I think that a lot rests in the hands of Leader Schumer of whether he will call a roll call on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. If he does, it's going to be game-changing, but Months have been passing and he hasn't yet.
And this has been a fascinating discussion. We could go on for much longer, but our time is almost up. Let me ask you as a final question. As college students begin to think about the coming year, as they begin to move into campuses in the next few weeks, what do you expect on college campuses in the fall?
I hate to say it, but we are expecting more trouble. We're expecting more trouble because we've seen all of the signs. We've seen some administrations indicating that they will permit a BDS resolution to be voted on. We know that that's going to be trouble on those campuses. We have seen increasing chatter by groups who are not only planning anti-Israel protests, but in some cases, including just over the last couple of days, supporting violent resistance against Zionism and urging that pro-Israel students be treated as criminals. So there is every prospect that the troubles will continue and perhaps intensify. In the past, generally speaking, when students get back to school in the fall, it takes a while before the problems really develop, and things are much worse in the spring than in the fall. There might be some of that. However, in the last couple of years, as there has been more online and digital communication, there's definitely been a great deal more organizing over the course of the summer so that the students who want to do harm to the Jewish community are ready to hit the ground running. We expect that to be the case. There are some colleges and universities that have been spending the summer fine-tuning their policies and procedures so that they will be able to address it, while there are others that have been acting like deers in the headlight and are not going to be able to deal with it. Sad to say, I think that this problem is going to get worse before it gets better.
And thank you. Unfortunate for the last sentiment, but really greatly appreciate this conversation. It's been a pleasure to talk with you and about these important issues on college campuses, but also, as you said, perhaps the less well understood issue in high schools and elementary and secondary schools. So thank you very much for joining with us today.
Pleasure to be with you.
And thank you to the audience also for joining us for another program from American Jewish University's Office of Open Learning. We greatly appreciate your attendance, your participation, and we very much hope that you'll visit our website, www.aju.edu, to see the exciting programs. And we also hope that you'll continue to support our programs in our university so we can continue to offer you exciting and informative programs like the one you just witnessed. So Ken, thank you very much. The audience, thank you very, very much. I hope you have a good day.